here a really special guest with us tonight. Ann Sanborn was the archivist at the Canterbury Shaker Village for 10 years. And she is a weaver and knows a ton. I'm going to let her tell you all about what she's done. And she's here to help me out with really the specifics of the weaving and knitting business in Canterbury.
Well, hi. I wasn't planning on weaving, but we can do a little bit
knitting. Knitting is all. That's good. We're knitting.
Susie found me last week, and so it's a little. I'm a little surprised. I don't work at Canterbury Shaker Village anymore, although I'm happy to go up and talk about it. But it was a great opportunity for me personally because I was a librarian. And I moved to Canterbury, and I'm 2 miles from the Canterbury Shaker Village. And at that period in time, they were bringing textiles in from the outer buildings to preserve them. And they were mostly everyone was a volunteer early on. And, so you volunteered in areas that you were interested in. Sometimes we might be working in the summer kitchen or whatever, just so that the occasional tourists we had, had something to eat. In Canterbury, there's not a restaurant really close by. So then I started to take care of the textiles, which was wonderful for me. And then they realized that I actually was a weaver. So then we got more technical about things, and that was a lot of fun. But also because I had a library degree, when they started to organize all the books that were coming in from the buildings and the records, then I got to be part of that, which dovetailed in a way for me that was wonderful because in the winter I could be working on the books and gathering the information about textiles for the museum. And in the summer I would be out, demonstrating and talking to people and talking to them about the shakers, because we have a walking tour there where you come and you go from building to building. Though of course right now with COVID, there's no, we're not doing that at all. They're not participating. But at Canterbury, one of the things that well, I should say that every Shaker Village was expected, as far as I understand, and my experience is all Canterbury. So expected to be able to support themselves. And so they looked for different things that would work better for them. So while almost all villages may have done almost everything, that may not have been their main source of income. And so New Hampshire soil is not that great for agriculture. So right away they were looking for other pursuits. And so the Shakers here developed a mill system that was based on low rise water hydropower, which is, I could never explain in an hour, let alone in 5 minutes, but this was very unusual, and yet it ran all of these mills. And the mills were, there were a clothier's mill, there was a weaving mill, there was a spinning mill, there were woodworking mills and turning mills, and a lot of that. But we're going to skip all of that and just talk a little bit about knitting. So just as when Susie was reading about the first years of production, the same is true at Canterbury, and knitting things will be mentioned. Everything that was being made for the family, the Canterbury Shaker family, the main family. And anything that was left over was what originally went for sale. And then over time, they started to build on that. And there were always, you'll see that there was half hose or there were mittens or something that is in the sale books. And then, at around in the 1800s, there's more, knitting machines are becoming more popular and of all different stripes. Originally, Queen Elizabeth said she was never going to give a patent, I think, to knitting machines because it would put good men and women out of business. But obviously things change as they must. But so the Shakers did make socks, and the Shakers had a reputation for making wonderful socks with very deep ribbing, which may have been exactly the same sort of ribbing that or stitchery that they used in the later in the Shaker sweaters. But socks were not made, if you knit them yourself, you could knit them in the round. But if you had any kind of early knitting machine, you'd knit them flat, you sewed them up, and the toes and the heels had to be done separately. And there's a sort of knitting, New Hampshire, Vermont, and maybe even parts of Maine sort of had a knitting machine, sock knitting machine controversy where everybody is trying to corner the market. But during all of that, it appears to me that Enfield, New Hampshire, had the biggest sock manufacturing. And they actually had a little mill that they were running. And then the Shakers do things in what I would call a niche environment. So they're want to do something that other people aren't doing so that they can sell that. So early on, they're weaving and they're turning out hundreds and thousands of yards and selling it. And everyone is talking about how good their cloth is and is paying that money for it. But then as more mills open up and the bigger mills open up, and they are not taking care of their people the way that the Shakers are taking care of their people, they have to feed them, they have to maintain the buildings and everything. The quality of that cloth that people can buy goes down, but it's cheaper. And so they find that just doing using the weaving mills isn't enough, and they're always looking for new markets. So what happened with the Shaker sock is that everybody was talking about Shaker socks, but after a bit, Enfield ends up selling that mill. And when they do, the man who takes it over continues to call it the Shaker mill. And then the Shaker socks suddenly don't appear to be the Shaker socks anymore. And then there's, various people who write and say, it's not a real Shaker sock anymore, etc. But it was then this period that the Shakers go from a flat knitting machine to a round sock knitting machine. And then they're also knitting by hand. And then there's the whole female clothing revolution thing, not just among the Shakers who don't change their clothing very much, but I think it was, I think her name is Abba Wilson, who's from Maine. She said, women's clothing is just this vast, incomprehensible sway of material which keeps them from getting anything done. And so she started to talk about, shawls being in the way when you're trying to work and that people should have sweaters. And so, we think of sweaters as having been there for forever, but they weren't really women's garb. And so the Shakers start to work on sweaters, but they're knitting them by hand. And then a man comes, this is not word for word, but a man came to the village and had an order of 12 dozen sweaters that he would give to us if we could have them done by December 24th. Now they have, or 20th. They have no date. They have no machines. I mean, they have no machines, but they take this order on. And I can only imagine that they used some of the flatbeds to help them. I don't know that for sure. And they knit these 144 sweaters for this man. And then they start buying machines. And they buy from the Lamb Company. And over time, they buy 5 machines. And they are knitting sweaters, and it becomes a major industry for the sisters. They are knitting, they had 2 kinds of sweaters. There was the famous letter sweaters that colleges use. The Shakers did those first. They, it looks more like a regular sweater. It's a little bit more boxy if you look at it up close, and they would have the letters on it. And they also personalized things. So there's examples of these sweaters that were made either for a particular sister who was quite stout, and when you look at the the lines of the sweater, you can see that the way it's built, and that she didn't like to have to pull her sleeves up, so the sleeves are 3/4. And there is a little there is an adorable little sweater that the sisters knit for one of the Shaker girls, and it has a big C on the front of it for Canterbury. And so she had her own little sweater. But then there were also these 3 kinds of coat sweaters. The main one was called the auto sweater because, of course, cars are getting going. And it has a triple collar that you can close up. And so if you're riding in your car, you'll stay warm. And they were using the knitting machines, sewing the body, for instance, in the round, and then slicing it open and putting the buttons on. Ethel Hudson, who was at the village when I first met the sisters, she was in charge of, as a young girl, of putting the buttons on the sweaters. And so she said she could do 3 sweaters in a day. and they used silk thread, and the buttons were made in the North shop, and they would carry them up to the North family farm, which is just up the road, and that was where all that finish work was done. So they made these sweaters, and let's see, I'm going to talk a little bit about so after the sweaters, what happens is at this point, there are more sisters than there are brothers in the village. And although I think Susie mentioned that sometimes the sisters would, their jobs were more, they were typical of what people thought men and women's jobs were often, although not always. But when you end up with something like 60 sisters and 11 brothers, oftentimes the brothers conducted the business with the world, and the sisters conducted the business within the village. And the sisters are realizing, of course, by 1850, you have the first feminism's getting big in England, and the sisters are aware of all of this. Plus, they're aware of their own, because of the way they've been working all their lives, they're aware of their own skills and their own talents and the things that they can do. And they suggest that they would like to completely run this business. And so Emmeline Hart and Lucy Shepherd become the caretakers of this business, and they found what's called Hart and Shepherd. And the sweaters and the Dorothy cloaks later, and poplar boxes, all of these things are sold under that moniker for them. And they start to apply for patents. Sometimes the patents that they apply for, they can't use the name, because especially with like shaker, there were other people who had started to use that term. And so you have to be able to prove that you're the only one using a term. It doesn't matter that you are the shaker. It's just whether the name's been being used. And so they found ways around that. So they might say like the Dorothy, the Dorothy's cloak is patented under the Dorothy as opposed to the shaker cloak. Now there were shaker cloaks come in different styles, and I think New Lebanon had a major shaker cloak industry. So they did all these things, and they had to learn how to do advertising. The poor sisters, they get a young woman who's going to pose so that they can send out postcards that show the sweaters and the coats and the different things for sale. And they have something like 1,000 postal cards ready to go out when the girl's family objects that her picture is going to be posted in newspapers and in all these places. And the sisters completely understand. So they negotiate with the girl and her family, and they said, okay, you can do postals, but only the blue ones. The postals were printed on blue cards and white cards. Of course, the white cards are clearer, so the blue cards be less likely to be able to identify the young woman. And so, here they are, they're struggling to get all of this done. And then they agree that they'll just send out the blue ones. They won't use any of the newspaper ads or any of that, because obviously that is going to upset her family. And they also start to make these little sales slips that will say things like, size and measurement and everything. So there is a great story about this one woman, Elle Beauchamp Hughes. The sisters started traveling. They took their wares and went to different places around the United States. And they were in New York City at like the Park Avenue Hotel or something, and they have a person who is taking these orders, and a gentleman who's measuring and getting all the measurements and sending them back up. And they didn't do anything that didn't have at least 15 different colors going. So, you had choices of colors, and you had all of this. And after the whole order is in, they receive this letter, which is in the archives, which is how I found it. And the woman writes to say that she doesn't think